Hi, I'm Rosina Snow. I'm the Director of Christian Discipleship at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church, a progressive community of faith in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is the second video in my series, Jesus Take the Phone, which is about why churches and congregations should start to create ways for their communities to cultivate attention in a wise way, to begin what I call a practice of attentional faithfulness in response to the ways that technology and iPhones and the prevalence of information and news and media, social media through the internet, how that is disrupting our ability to use our attention wisely. So I want to begin with two quotes by Fred Banson, who is a writer and farmer, author of the book Soil and Sacrament, which I highly recommend. And these are two quotes from him, from that book. "It is prayer that keeps the world from spinning off its axis." And "Trying to save an imperiled world is for naught unless that work is undergirded by a rigorous prayer life." Now, I think these two claims are fairly incredible for modern ears to hear, even those of us in the church, because our society places such a strong emphasis and priority on action as opposed to more quiet forms of being. And I'm not a faith over works person at all, but I think we run up to some resistance when we think that the most powerful thing we can do that undergirds everything else is something quiet and passive seeming like prayer. But the more that I look into prayer and what it does on just a brain level and how important certain states of mind are to undergird any kind of action that's going to be transformative in our world, the more I come to agree with that, especially when we start to think of prayer as a form of attention. And that is another fairly incredible claim to make, that prayer is a form of, or maybe even is, attention. And that many other spiritual practices, whether of meditation, of bearing witness to others' pain, there's a long list of what I would consider to be spiritual disciplines, but that all of it comes back to a common denominator, which is that you are focusing your attention on the divine, on words of scripture, on nature, on one another, on all the places that God is at work in the world. And there's some research in neuroscience that speaks to this. So in neuroscience, there's a concept of absorption. And absorption was first talked about as a way to gauge whether someone was susceptible or seemed to be very responsive to experiences that were mystical, particularly hypnosis and hallucinogenics. That's where the research started. And the person who started this research, named Telegen, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, created a scale. And people who scored high on this scale tended to be more open to mystical experiences, or have a proclivity for mystical experiences, or an openness to self-altering experiences. And people who would score high on this scale were people who talked about being highly affected by music and art and poetry, having really strong emotional responses to stimuli in nature, such as a beautiful sunset, people who would experience awe and wonder quite easily, people with very vivid imaginations who would get lost in reading books or in their own imaginations and inner worlds, people who could recall dreams really well. So people who would score high on this scale also tended to be more likely to have more mystical experiences. There's been some recent research by someone named Michael Lifshitz, who did a review of the relationship between religious experiences and absorption. So there are many people who seek to really feel a connection and closeness to God, to have strong spiritual mystical experiences of a feeling of connection with God, but not everyone does, even within religious communities. And so this was a review of various research along these lines. And what they found is it's not frequency or duration of prayer that leads to a feeling of connection with God, that it's more about if you are someone who would score higher on the absorption scale. So people with a strong proclivity for mystical experiences tend to have them more. That's not super groundbreaking, I don't think. But what's really interesting to me is that one of the things Telegen says is strongly correlated with absorption is really focused attention on stimuli outside of the self, which is everything we're talking about with attentional faithfulness, or just cultivating deeper attention towards things. He says that objects of absorbed attention acquire an importance and intimacy that are normally reserved for the self, and may therefore require a temporary self-like quality. These object identifications have mystical overtones. So in other words, if you are cultivating the ability to pay attention to that which surrounds you rather than yourself, you are more likely to also score high on this scale and experience more closeness with God. So this video isn't me telling you how you should pray, how you should cultivate spiritual disciplines around attention. There are so many ways to do that. The resources are pretty much endless. You can do it through scripture, and that's going to keep you busy for a while. The Bible's pretty long. You can sit on your back porch and watch the birds and think about, where is God in this? All of that is valid as long as you are paying attention and you're cultivating that practice on a daily basis. I can speak from personal experience that even if a couple times a day I spend some time to be quiet, to quiet my mind, to pray, to look out the window and observe what I see, to take a walk, and also be more mindful about my phone use, I don't necessarily feel the change right then when I first start doing it, but within a couple of days, there's like a shift in the way that life feels, where music feels more vibrant and I have a stronger emotional response to it, where when I take a walk, I'm picking up more sensory stimuli from nature, and it's affecting me. And there's a sort of loveliness that comes into just mundane things. And louder stimuli, like from our phones, more attention-grabbing things like that, are not as appealing. And I think this is the experience and the feeling of falling back in love with the divine, with the ways that the divine is present and working in the world. Now, all this research from neuroscience didn't exist when Jesus walked the earth, but I think his life and ministry show us that he understood how foundational prayer is and how foundational attention is. You can tell from the time that he spends in nature, going off by himself to talk with God, how much of that was a focus of attention on the divine, on the way that God was showing up for him in nature. You can see from the parables and the details that they talk about, or that the details that he uses from nature, what's observed in nature, that he's paying very close attention to his surroundings, to relationships between different creatures and different ecological phenomena. And prayer certainly undergirds the work that Jesus does in the world. Going back to the Banson quote, that we're not going to change anything unless what we do is undergirded by prayer, which really is changing our brains and the way that we move through the world through practices of attention, through attentional faithfulness. In How to Do Nothing, Jenny Odell, and I talked about this book in the last video, also highly recommended. She talks about how obviously there is a question of privilege and who has the time and space to cultivate attention, because so many people are just in a moment-to-moment survival mode. And I'll just read what she has to say about that. There is a significant portion of people for whom the project of day-to-day survival leaves no attention for anything else. That's part of the vicious cycle too. This is why it's even more important for anyone who does have a margin, even the tiniest one, to put it to use in opening up margins further down the line. Tiny spaces can open up small spaces. Small spaces can open bigger spaces. If you can afford to pay a different kind of attention, you should. And this starts to lead into the next video in the Jesus Take the Phone series, which is about cultivating attentional faithfulness in community, and how by working together, we can start to open up those spaces for attention for each other, with each other, even those of us who don't have as much space to begin with. So I hope that you'll stay with me for that next video on community, and videos after that on nature and on bearing witness, and how these are also powerful ways to practice attentional faithfulness. Again, if you're curious about our ministries at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church, we are a sanctuary church. We are a reconciling Methodist church, and you can look at all our ministries on our website. And if you want to get involved, whether you live in Charlottesville or not, you can look at the form underneath the video and send us a message letting us know how you want to get involved, and we will respond.
People nowadays know